Now, as a former spy master who has spent a good deal of his career in and around Europe, what is my particular take on these worrying events? First, when massive social forces are at work, and mass migration is such a force, a whole government response is required and a high degree of international cooperation. Intelligence and security services are simply contributors to a strong policy making. In the real world, there are no miraculous James Bond-style solutions. Simply shutting the door on migration is not an option. History tells us that human tides are irresistible unless the gravitational pull that causes them is removed. Edward Gibbon elegantly charted how Rome, with all its civic and administrative sophistication and military prowess, could not stop its empire being overrun by the mass movement of Europe's tribes. Second, we should not conflate the problem of migration with the threat of terrorism. High levels of immigration, particularly from the Middle East, coupled with freedom of movement inside the EU, make effective border control more difficult. Terrorists can and do exploit these circumstances, as we saw recently in their movement between Brussels and Paris and to and from Syria. With large numbers of people on the move, a few of them will inevitably carry the terrorist virus. However, effective border control is not the most important part of countering terrorism. It does not pick up clean skins, nor those who are switching their identities. Good intelligence, drawing on human and technical sources, and the analysis of data flows is the key to effective counter-terrorism. And a number of the most lethal terrorists are from inside Europe, including the UK. They are already amongst us. Third, for reasons that I don't have time to explain, the UK, compared to most of its European partners, is good at this sort of intelligence work. Its European and global standing is high. The EU, as opposed to its member states, has no operational counter-terrorist capability to speak of. Many European states look to the UK for training. I remember when Hungary was leaving the Soviet orbit, the head of the Hungarian intelligence service asked me, "Where are these European committees, and when do I get invited?" To his great surprise, I explained to him that they didn't exist, and that the place for him to start, perhaps, was in a bilateral exchange with the UK. More than a decade later, Hungary is amongst the most autonomous of the smaller European powers in matters of its national security. They learned quickly. Successive Labour and Conservative governments have been careful not to let Britain's EU membership dilute the UK's own responsibility for its national security. When a European constitution was under discussion in 2003, the UK was insistent that the draft document, which was never adopted, did not contain references to national security. The only significant European intrusion into sensitive security areas in the UK have been by the European Court of Human Rights, which has hampered the government's handling of some terrorist suspects. But I should add that this court, though European, is institutionally separate from the EU. The argument that we would be less secure if we left the EU is in reality rather difficult to make. There would in fact be some gains as if we left, because the UK would be fully master of its own house. Counter-terrorist coordination across Europe would certainly continue, and the UK would remain a leader in the field. The idea that the quality of that cooperation depends in any significant way on our EU membership is misleading. The urgency of counter-terrorist work, the quality of the EU's expertise, the practical and moral imperatives that drive liaison exchanges, and the shared civic revulsion when terrorist violence is unleashed on innocent citizens is what binds the UK into excellent intelligence and security relations with every individual EU member, not the fact that the UK is also in the EU. During the Cold War, neither we nor the French were restrained from working together in the most sensitive areas of intelligence exchange about the Soviet threat, although France was not a member of NATO. This is a telling comparison. Intelligence and security liaison is highly pragmatic and outside the military sphere is, generally speaking, not subject to formal treaty agreements. Which brings me back to the main question. Is the EU faced with the problem of mass migration, able to coordinate an effective response from its member countries? Should the UK stay in and continue to struggle for fundamental change, or do we conclude that the effort would be wasted and that the EU in its extended form has run its historical course? For each of us, this is possibly the most important electoral choice that we may ever have to make. We should understand also that our choice is going to be strategic for the UK's future. Whether we will each be worse off, whether our national security might be damaged, even whether the economy might falter and sterling be devalued, are subsidiary to the key question, which is whether we have confidence in the EU to manage Europe's future. If Europe cannot act together to persuade a majority of its citizens that it can gain control of its migratory crisis, then the EU will find itself at the mercy of a populist uprising which is already stirring. The stakes are very high, and the UK referendum is the first roll of the dice in a bigger geopolitical game. Thank you.